Wasepi, Huron, Band of Potawatomi, and the Machipiнаchuish Band of Potawatomi. For those of you who don't know, Kalamazoo, traditional name, Iskegumazol. Iskegumazol, and it really means that they boil it down. And so I like to imagine the, way back in the day that this was a big old sugar bush area where people were coming down and boiling sap and who knows what else, right? But anyway, it's good to be here today. Miigwech.
Thank you.
We're going to go ahead and get started then. Okay. Looks like we're being recorded. Okay. So what is a logic model? Some people might say it's at its simplest, a logic model is a graphic representation that depicts programmatic relations. Graphic representations are a form of art. Art is a culturally informed and in turn impacts the evolution of culture. This is known as a dialectic relationship. So how we think about logic shapes how we visualize it and act on it as individuals and collectivities. Now, one of our friends who's here on site with us today, he and I graduated from the same program at Lake Superior State University, where I was introduced to the Thomas theorem as part of sociology. And in the Thomas theorem, this W.I. Thomas guy, who was an American sociologist back in the 1920s, says, if people define situations as real, they are real in their consequences. And of course, you use the sexist language of the day. If men define situations as real, which, is a whole nother story. But, what do you think of when we say that? Like, what does that even mean? If people define situations as real, they are real in their consequences. If you're online, maybe you can say some thoughts in the chat room. Here on site, what are some of your thoughts? We say that. What does it make you think about?
I'll chime in here.
Sure.
Ron Vischer. Well, first, he's, I think, at least talking about the philosophical question about what is real. And he's saying something that not everyone necessarily believes is real really is. That is thoughts about situation.
Okay.
Most people narrow reality down to something more specific or narrow, like what you see or can perceive or observe. So,
Okay.
I don't know.
Ron. I appreciate that contribution to our discussion. Does anyone else have any thoughts about what they think that means?
The people act on what they believe is real.
Can you guys hear her online? Okay. Okay. People act on what they believe is real.
Yeah, so it doesn't matter if something's like quote unquote real, people will act accordingly and those actions in of themselves have consequences.
That is exactly it. Yes.
Ooh,
So,
awesome. Okay.
Ron gave us a good segue and you brought it home. And that is exactly what happens here.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And so when individuals do that, it has consequences for themselves and the people around them. But when collectivities do that, it has a much bigger impact. And so when we think about evaluation, when we think about what is Indian, when we put those two ideas together, it can have a very serious impact globally. Especially when we think about the level of, what is Native American? What does that mean? What does it mean to be indigenous on a global level? And how do we approach this idea? So it is very important. I think it's a great place to start when we're thinking or rethinking what we do as researchers and evaluators. So just thinking about the medicine wheel logic model in relationship to other logic models. And I've seen some friends that I have online here. That's cool to see them in the audience, like Don McAtee there. So as we compare and contrast the medicine wheel logic model with other logic models, we may find that there's a significant overlap. And that is certainly to be expected. The logic model on this slide here is the one I was required to use, and quote, required to use when working as a Native American outreach worker for the University of Wisconsin Extension. It was an expectation as part of the job. And so that way it was all standardized. And in some ways, it kept us very well organized as we were working together. But, it felt to me very foreign and very linear as I was trying to put a lot of my circular thoughts into this very square hole. And so that just didn't fit with what I was used to from an Anishinaabe cultural perspective. And that's really when I began in earnest developing the medicine wheel logic model that I use today for the work I do, both as a professor and an evaluator and other various parts of my life. And, it really mattered to me at that point in time. I really struggled with that because, here I was doing outreach work as a Native person with Native communities about Native issues, and really kind of being forced into this other way of thinking about it. It just felt very invasive. So in Anishinaabemowin, the language of the Anishinaabe Three Fires Confederacy, Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi, we have a term, Nagadwendon, that translates to think about it. Nagadwendon. Go ahead and try it, everybody. If you're not familiar with Anishinaabe, today's a good lesson. Nagadwendon.
Nagadwenda.
Hey, there we go. There's Nikki. So, so when I think about how I think, I visualize it as a medicine wheel. To me, it's like wearing a contact lens in front of my brain. So everything going in and out filters through this image. And you can see it's kind of fuzzy, right? It's what people might think of as fuzzy logic. But to me, it's because there's the known and the unknown. And we don't pretend to know everything. We leave plenty of space for those unexpected and unknown variables. But that's what I like to think. I tell my students, you can visualize it as contact lenses or eyeglasses, but to me, it's like that third eye that you think of. With anyone do yoga? When they talk about that third eye, that's what, or those chakras. So the medicine wheel is a basic teaching tool for the Anishinaabe and other indigenous peoples about life in general. The circle represents life, spirit, health. So it's a healthy form of logic. It's at the same time Kichimanadu, the great spirit, but also each individual spirit, being that exists within the universe, including ourselves. While our spirits dwell within our bodies, they exist as one and the same. We're taught that we are spirit beings having a human experience. The center of the medicine wheel is our center, or our jichab. When it's aligned with the world around us, it's the place of balance and harmony, or minobimadas, the good life. We may not ever get to stay in the center very long, but when we pass through it, it sure feels great. And we always strive to get back to it. It represents large ideas and small ideas. It represents the known and the unknown. It represents concentric circles emanating from the center to the edge, or vice versa. But it also represents kin-centric circles, where all parts are interrelated to other parts. Because this is a symbol of spirit, it also reminds me about what my friend Dr. Robin Wall Kimmerer says about ceremony. Ceremony focuses attention so that attention becomes intention. If you stand together and profess a thing before your community, it holds you accountable. And isn't that what evaluation is about? Ceremony. Wawiyeya. Everybody say that now. Wawiyeya. Boy, you guys are good. So why is all this important for a presentation about evaluation? First, it's important to note that this model is circular, but it's also directional with a point of origin that is thought of as generational. It begins in the eastern direction and progresses southward, westward, and northward. In this way, it's relational with other beings that may have come before us, those who are here with us today, and those who are yet to come. In his 2004 article, Indigenous Pedagogy in the Classroom, a Service Learning Model for Discussion, McNally explained that in Ojibwe culture, the transmission of cultural knowledge is temporal, relational, and situational, and it's used in service of community. From an Anishinaabe perspective, we truly live in circles and spiral through time. So this is a fillable form, a medicine wheel logic model fillable form. In my NAS 488 Native American Community Engagement class, I require students to use this form as they work with community partners to identify, plan, implement, and reflect on 4 service learning projects. That's a tall order for one semester and for students who may not have any orientation to the Native American community in general at all. The fillable form is a way for the students to begin visualizing their approach to each project, but eventually becomes a project summary and cover sheet for a longer and much more detailed accounts of their experience in each project, including formative and summative evaluations for each component in each direction. The students may find the lines between one direction and another is overlapping and fuzzy at times, as there are factors that influence programs and projects that might have been overlooked and therefore require some type of iteration. I can tell you that it's a daunting task. And when they are presented with this, they're like, what? You want us to do that? How many weeks? You know, so it's a good challenge. So this is how a student, Linnea Bemis, I don't know if Linnea is online today or not, but anyway, I'm very proud of the work that Linnea did. I always aspire that we will have students come to our classes that really grasp what we're talking about and then run with it. It's really cool. So Linnea was in my class and she took on this project as part of designing an Indigenous foods event planning toolkit. I'm a foodie. Guys, you don't know that. I like treaties, I like food, and I like, education. So we took this project as part of the Indigenous Food Sovereignty Symposium. And the students put together this toolkit and they thought, you know what, if we're using a medicine wheel logic model to approach this project, why shouldn't we share that with the people who are actually doing a program? And so they did, they redid it, and what a beautiful job they did. You can see evaluation is center to what it is that this model is about. And they go in each direction and they have the Anishinaabe terminology with explanations, translations, and it's just really nice the way they did that. So I wanted to showcase that as part of the work here today. Wabanong. Go ahead, say it. Wabanong. Okay. Where the tomorrow comes from. We're taught that all things begin in the East. We're born in the East. This is where we begin our journey. Most logic models fail to include ceremony and identity as inputs into a system. This medicine wheel logic model, however, expects that we will have opening ceremony and treats identity as the point of origin. Identity permeates everything else within a system. Taking time for ceremony at this point lets us begin in a good way. We have engaged in talking circles as a way to ceremonialize the coming together of people around a project or program. We ask participants to share their thoughts about their identity and how it may impact their participation. There are many facets of identity that can be explored within the context of valuation. But the primary 3 we focus on in a Native American context are biological.
I lost audio. Martin, you're on mute.
Means that someone is born into a Native American family.
Oh, they're saying that you're muted, actually.
How far back?
I don't think very long.
Okay, let me,
Maybe start with your four.
Okay,
It said about 40 seconds.
okay. So let's see, Nikki, tell me if you heard me say something about taking time for ceremony.
I didn't because I was warming up my egg sandwich.
Nikki's not a good example. Don McAtee, tell me if you heard me say something about the expectations of ceremony for the beginning of a medicine well logic model. I'm putting people on the spot now.
Yeah, we heard that. It was
Okay,
probably the last thing I heard. I don't know.
They said
okay,
up to biology.
got it. Okay, so I'll start there. So what
The
I
most
said was,
important thing, you gotta celebrate, baby. Celebrate your life first.
that's right, that's right. So we need to examine our identity for ourselves and others in relationship to the work that we're doing or intend to do, and how our identity may impact the relationship. Biological identity means that someone is born into a Native American family. In other words, at least one of their biological parents is Native themselves. Cultural identity may be independent from other forms of identity. If someone was raised in a Native cultural context, but does not have Native parents and is also not a citizen of a tribe, does that mean that they are now, or that they're not part of a cultural community? Right? So they may not be able to identify as Native American themselves, but that does not negate that they were perhaps raised in a cultural community. We have lots of non-Native relatives, in other words, and they're part of our communities, and we have to account for that. So cultural identity includes spirituality, language, music, food, dress, values, teachings. It's very deep. When you think about that, they usually that iceberg of culture, the visual culture and the deep culture. Sometimes it's not obvious what people carry with them. Perhaps the most least understood is the legal and political identity, which centers on citizenship and rights, including Aboriginal rights, treaty rights, and civil rights. Someone could be a citizen of a tribe, but they may not have been raised in a Native cultural context. Most tribes require at least lineal descent in order to be eligible for tribal citizenry. Individual Native people may be citizens of tribe in addition to being citizens of the United States or other foreign nations. Yes, I said the United States is a foreign nation there. And resident citizens of the states they live in. Sometimes we forget that states are sovereign entities, so are provinces, that they have their own laws and they have their own sovereignty, certain aspects of life. So tribes are sovereign units of government that may have jurisdiction over certain areas that impact evaluation. It can make a difference to the evaluation relationship if those doing the evaluation are Native, as well as if those being evaluated are Native. There may be instances when the program is a Native program, but the folks doing the work for the program and those evaluating it are all non-Native. Identity can impact how the players relate to the issues and the situations they find themselves dealing with, their bond with others, and their commitment and care for the community. It matters when the relationship is close and lifelong versus being just a work thing and temporary. This is about keeping it real and having matched expectations about what should happen. Is it feasible to expect that something can happen in the time period that is allowed? Does the system have adequate resources available to truly address the task at hand? This is also a good time for evaluators to practice engaging with community partners. For folks that are not familiar with Indian country, it is a time for them to ask questions and even learn how to ask questions. It's a time for everyone to sharpen their data collection and interpersonal skills before ever engaging with others outside of the evaluation organization. This is a time to do your work, your homework, visit websites about the community partner, read their newsletters, and otherwise familiarize yourself with them beforehand. This is a show of respect. This is all part of the formative evaluation process. And that's just the eastern direction. I think our screen went off. Are we okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think the folks online are probably not
Yeah.
experiencing the glitches that we are, but
Okay.
happy to hear. So I think it'll resolve eventually. It's some sort of Problem with the connection.
All right, no problem. We'll roll along. All right, Jawanong. Everybody say Jawanong. The southern direction where the birds fly off to during the winter. This direction represents our adolescence, the time of preparing to become adults, learning from our elders about how to live minobimades, or the good life. This is a low stakes environment and where it's okay to make mistakes so we can learn from them and adjust and beta test ideas before we get out into the high stakes environment of the real world. This is the development phase of our projects and programs. This is a time when we are asking who, what, where, when, why, and how. In this direction, we are maintaining fidelity to the stated goals and objectives as plans are developed.
Forward your screen.
Oh. Jawanang again, there we go. Sorry, guys, I forgot to forward the screen. So this is a time in this direction where we ask, are we maintaining fidelity to the stated goals and objectives as plans are being developed? In other words, are we planning with the end in mind? This seems to be a difficult task for many people to think through. Many folks are just not used to thinking about how their plans are going to impact their futures in the short, medium, and long term. In Anishinaabe culture, we're taught to think 7 generations into the future. And this is much more far-reaching than a 2-year grant cycle and a 10-year plan. We're talking about our great-grandchildren's great-grandchildren. As Anishinaabe people, we're also bound to our traditional teachings and values. We have to ask ourselves, it's incumbent upon us as traditional people, if we are planning and if it's aligned with what is known as the 7 grandfathers: love, respect, bravery, humility, honesty, wisdom, and ultimately our truth. We have to ask ourselves if we are being true to our spiritual relationships and upholding our responsibilities as members of our dotem or our large kinship families. Are we honoring our treaty promises with plants, animals, other tribes, and the foreign nations that we made treaties with? We often don't think about the idea of treaty making as being a human and more than human relationship. On a practical level, we are determining the universe of various components and strategies that we will engage with to accomplish the goals and objectives, as well as determining what resources are needed for these tasks. Conducting literature reviews, as well as engaging in dialogue with knowledge holders, may be part of the development process, and is a good, if it's a good plan based on promising culturally informed and responsive practices. We offer sema, or tobacco, as a symbol of reciprocity or the giving of life for life when we ask for traditional knowledge or assistance with forming our plan. And this is all also part of the formative evaluation process. Ningabianang. Ningabianang, everybody say it. That's good. Well, everyone's doing so good with that. I hope you like the turtle image on this screen here. That's something that I drew and my buddy helped me do a painting on. That comes from our traditional Turtle Island creation stories. And my wife's Turtle Clan. So I always think that I drew this for her. And she says, no, you drew that before you met me. But I must have been envisioning her, you know, at some point. Ningabianang, the western direction where our spirits travel. This is the direction of the leadership generation. We are responsible for our elders and our youth. We are responsible for not only doing things that were planned, but for doing them well in a way that does not bring harm to ourselves and others. Do things in a good way and good things will happen. That's a basic teaching. We may smudge ourselves with the smoke from the sage and other medicines before we begin our work, or maybe as a way to clean up ourselves up after we've encountered negativity. We visualize the plan as a turtle island of stasis in an ocean of chaos. We examine how leadership is structured and functions. Is it authoritative, servant, or distributive, or a combination of all the above? We try to maintain high fidelity with the plan while operationalizing it but we also remain humble and remember that we don't know what we don't know. Unanticipated factors require that evaluation be flexible, iterative, and adaptive to account for things we may do that fall outside of the plan, or for those parts of the plan that just didn't go the way we thought they would. As a parent, it's like watching your child go off into the big world, and you just hope you've prepared them enough for what they will encounter. But you're still there for them if they come home needing to do their laundry or eat something besides ramen noodles. This direction also represents the line between formative and summative evaluation. Yue de none. Yue de none. I just trust that the people online are saying these things. Yue de none, the northern direction, the coming home star. I really like that pictograph on the wall here, because it shows that human form there. You see that human form, and you see those animal forms, and including the birds and the plants. You can barely see the plants, the trees and stuff. But this is cool because this, is our ancestors. As Anishinaabe, this is a message from our ancestors during a pre-colonial context to future generations. So it's very cool to see these things. And you imagine that they still exist on these canyon walls and these overlooks, like Lake Superior and such. And you wonder, how did they know that would last so long? Right? I mean, we get some pretty ferocious weather, waves and, ice, and it's, anything that lasts in a northern Michigan winter, it's got to be amazing materials. So this is the place of our elders, the winter time of our lives, where we look back and think about how things went. As we reflect, we compare what actually happened to our long, medium, and short-term goals and objectives. We ask ourselves if we accomplished what we set out to do, as well as what anticipated things happened that caused us to alter our course and adapt. This is where we present the outcomes of our work to our community partners and offer recommendations. This is the time for another talking circle. As evaluators, we should also pause and think about how this experience has impacted us personally. How did we do as evaluators? How did we grow in our relationship to community and in our profession? We should ask, how did our identity as a Native or non-Native person impact our role as an evaluator? This is also a time of celebration, Ron. We may sing, we may feast as a way to memorialize our good work. This is the direction of summative evaluation, but it is also the line between this generation and the next. This is a time capsule where we send a message to the future, just like our ancestors did in that pictograph. So who owns medicine wheel logic models? The image I created on this slide represents the decolonization and revitalization process. The circle on the left has the colors of the Anishinaabe medicine wheel and represents our pre-colonial ways of knowing and doing. The middle part shows a triangle foregrounding the circle. This represents colonization and the hierarchical nature of this society. The last image on the right-hand side shows a return to a circular way of life that has incorporated the best ideas while getting rid of the forms of oppression. This model is based on Xinguac's vision, as well as the writings of Paulo Freire in Pedagogy of the Oppressed. While it's flattering that non-Native people think our ways are cool and want to include them in their work, it's also very important to think about how to best approach this process.
Scriven downstairs, please. He wasn't answering.
Hey, Ron, you're off mute.
I think John just muted him. Okay. So it's important to think. I'm going to start that sentence for the third time. All right. It's important to think how to best approach this idea without wholesale appropriating it. I believe there are ways to do this. One obvious way is to integrate traditional knowledge is to remove the barriers so that traditional knowledge holders can act as part of or lead teams that are doing evaluations and privilege the knowledges that they carry with them to the group. It's important to remember that just because someone is native doesn't mean that they carry traditional ways of knowing with them. That just doesn't come, by birth. Sometimes non-native people have more knowledge about native stuff than the native people themselves. If that's the situation you find yourself in, it's still incumbent upon the evaluative leadership team to make authentic attempts to engage native knowledge holders in the process, especially when dealing with their communities. I realize that time is often a major deciding factor in evaluative processes, and deadlines are often non-negotiable. This can pose a serious mismatch for native ways that are much more natural and forgiving. You guys have heard of Indian time. That doesn't mean we all come to work late, but Nikki does. No, I'm just kidding, Nikki. Nikki's like there before everybody else.
What's Indian time?
Indian time, it's interesting. I think it just goes back to what I was just saying. It's a more natural and forgiving process, a sense of time. And you think about it, how it is explained to me by our elders in our community and family is that when it's supposed to happen, it will. You can't force it. And if you try to force it, that's when bad things happen. You get out of alignment with the way it's supposed to be naturally. So we often find ourselves in that when we're trying to do what I did working for Wisconsin, right? Trying to put our circular peg into a square hole, and it just doesn't fit. And so we often find ourselves struggling with that. Having a good understanding of how a medicine wheel logic model works is a good way to preempt those situations by doing your best to address these concerns beforehand. Making it a personal and professional goal to reach out and get to know traditional knowledge holders ahead of time is a great way to try and avoid bad relations. Lastly, remember, there's a great deal of diversity in how Native people think about evaluation. The thoughts I shared today come from my experience as an educator and as a part of an evaluation team that I've experienced many of the things I spoke about firsthand. Nikki and I have teamed up on many evaluative experiences. And I can tell you, Nikki and I, we share a lot of similarities, but we also come from different tribal communities and different teachings. And so we respect each other's teachings and we move forward with that in mind. I hope that this presentation has been informative, that it's made you think, and that it might help improve your practices in a good way.
Dr. Reinhardt, can you see Nikki's comment? I wonder if you might.
I cannot.
Oh, okay, I'll read it then. She said, I just want to share it for the room. She said, so all the rushing deadlines with hurry and collect data, hurry and get the report in, hurry and meet, hurry to build partnerships, etc. Thoughtful and ample time is certainly needed. And in response to your comments about how your similarities have come from different cultures, I think it's important to point out, she did say, I am the funnier one.
And so sometimes we're just plain wrong. Not me. Okay. Gugwedwinon questions. Gugwedwinon. Nukwetumwinon answers. The image on this slide is a painting by Jesse Agwa regarding Shingwak's vision. Jesse Agwa is an Ojibwe artist from the Batchewana First Nation of Ojibwe. Shingwak was an influential Anishinaabe Ojibwe leader who fought against the United States in the War of 1812. And it's unfortunate that a lot of our cultural heroes are never mentioned in US history because we were the enemy. And so we need to realize that. His vision of education for Anishinaabe people included both native and non-native ideas. In this image, you can see the children are dressed in westernized clothing and they're reading books. They're also out on the land, standing in front of a medicine lodge, where a traditional teacher is offering sema, tobacco, and saying prayers. The sacred pipe and the drum are there along with teachings about sacred beings. The prayers are then carried on eagle feathers into the sky world and shared with the rest of creation. So I fasted with 6 other people. There were 7 of us who fasted. We were chosen by Dr. Dan Pine Sr., Mushkikin, a medicine person from our community. Dan Pine was the grandson of Shingwak. And so, for me to be part of that in my own personal life, this is just when I was a young man, just got back out of the Army. And to be placed out there with these older folks, I didn't have any idea what that would mean to me. To me, it was like, oh, that's cool. I'm going on a fast, and this medicine person put me out there. But as I learned through that fast and since then, that's over 30 years ago now. It's amazing how that vision from Shingwak through his grandson to me and those others has impacted the work I do. And I really do. I carry that vision with me. I think it's important to remember that sometimes we don't get our own visions. Sometimes our visions are the ones we share with those who have come before, and how we then carry them to share them with those who will come after and who are with us here today. So I'm going to open up some space for some dialogue, and I'm not sure exactly how much time we have left because I have lost time, as I usually do during presentations and classes, and the students remind me by looking at their watches. And is that a thing anymore? Do students look at watches, or is it phones now? Like that thing. Well, we do have a watch here. Okay. Phone on the wrist. So why don't we go ahead and open it up for some questions? We'll try to balance it. We'll have a question, say, from here on site, and a question from online. We'll go rock back and forth so we have good balance. How about that?
Nikki had a comment in the chat. Nikki, you could just come off mute and share that if you'd like.
Okay, I had a question too. So first of all, I just want to say a big aho and shout out to Western Michigan University for bringing Marty on. I really appreciate the collaborative partnership we have here, just to hear Marty or any of the other, Indigenous speakers you're bringing on, and how the way we do things applies to the academic life that we live, our roots, really is wonderful. And it shows the impact of our collective good medicine together that we're braiding together here. And a question I had for Dr. Reinhardt is about revealed knowledge. We're just finishing up 18 or 19 papers for the decolonization special issue for the Journal of Multidisciplinary Evaluation, also put out by the Western Michigan University. And that'll come out in early 2023, I hope. But the role of revealed knowledge, which we would call sacred knowledge, or knowledge that's given to you through ceremony, visioning, dreams, what role does that play in evaluation, whether it's evaluation theory, policy, practice, thought, because it sort of gets dismissed because it's not from the rational logical framework. So I don't know if you want to talk about that at all. That's just a question that I had, because one of the papers very deeply covers this, and I can't wait for people to read the issue. But anyways, this is about you, not about the issue.
Yeah, what a great question. Miigwech for that question, Nikki.
Yep.
So, those knowledges, right? Their origins matter. And so there are protocols that we are expected to abide by. As an Anishinaabe person, if I just, if I go to my community and I take this sacred knowledge that's been entrusted to me, and I go out there and I sell it or somehow misuse it, well, that's my bad. I've broken protocol, and maybe bad things will come from that, right? Maybe I will not be trusted with those knowledges again, or maybe someone will pick those up and use them in a way that they were never intended to. They'll bastardize them, right? How many times have we seen our traditional knowledges misused out there by people who are wanting to claim it as their own, right? They actually put their name on it and copyright it, things that don't even come from them, that come from our teachers. That, we have to be careful. We have to do things in a good way, as I stated in the presentation. How do we protect those knowledges, I guess, is one of the biggest questions when we're dealing with those things that can help our work, can really inform our work, but we also have a duty to protect them. And I think that, we have to privilege those knowledge holders, those carriers of the knowledge, first of all, that they're going to lead the teams in that. Maybe they don't lead everything, but maybe they lead on that aspect, because they know the protocols, they know what can be shared, they know what can't be shared. So I think that's one thing. I think that, if we think about how traditional knowledges have been overlooked in the academia, how it's been overlooked in research. I think that, again, we have to say, well, we're not surprised by that. We've been colonized for how many years? Every day we wake up in a colonized society. And so it doesn't surprise me when they have not privileged our knowledge in this world. But I think they have also stolen our knowledge. And so I think there are things that have made it into the research programs, the theories and such, that we just don't get credit for. I think that was some of those misuses. There's a book out by Tinker that I use in the class I teach about Native American religious experiences in relationship to other world religions. And in that book, Tinker says, we didn't understand what they didn't understand about spirituality when we encountered them. I think our ancestors assumed that people were well-meaning and that they had the same understanding of spirit that we did. And so it's a very unfortunate thing, because I think some of our knowledge from those early encounters made its way into the early anthropological or sociological or whatever texts. But then they bastardized them and they didn't give us credit for them, or they somehow warped them and made them into something that they were never intended to be. It's always interesting to me how if you go online and you do a search for medicine wheels, and you look at how other people outside of Indian country have used them, how strange they look to me. I'm like, geez, that doesn't sound anything like what I understand about our medicine wheel, teachings. And it's always interesting, right? And not in a good way. And Nikki and I we've been the victims of people just stealing our stuff. We spend a lot of time going and asking our elders, is this okay to share? And how do we share it? And so when we bring it forward and we ask people who we're working with, to do things in a good way, and then they do it in a bad way, that hurts our feelings. And it hurts our relationship with our community. And people don't understand how deep that is in our communities. We were entrusted to share that with our colleagues. And it's not just something you willy-nilly go off and, take and steal and then, try to get credit for because it's your ego, So yeah, we've seen that happen. I kind of been going on. I don't know, Nikki, does that hit on some of what you're talking about there?
It does. And I think just figuring out, how you elevate different forms of, it comes into, in terms of epistemology or ontology and like what counts, where does knowledge come from and what counts as knowledge? It's rough depending on what context you're in.
Oh yeah. Well, even like documenting your resources, right? Using APA style to say, how did I come to have this knowledge? Well, when you're documenting oral tradition, how do you go about that? Right? It used to be like when I was back in grad school and even before that you had to say personal communication. That was it. The only way you get to even include it is say a personal communication. Well, we've taken it on in Indian country and we've said, no, that's not good enough. That doesn't respect our oral tradition. It doesn't really respect the traditional knowledge holders. And I think that now we're coming up with new ways to document how that knowledge comes to our research and our processes. And I think that's really important, to be able to show the respect even in the citations and the references sections. We'll take a question from here on site now.
Can you go
ahead.
Can you go back to the logic model? I couldn't read them. Can you just walk us through that? I don't know if others read.
The fillable form?
Yeah.
Yeah, so we have in the east. So remember, we start in the east.
Mhm.
That's where, at least with this logic model.
We also use colors.
And the yellow is what represents east for us. Now, different cultural groups, they use different colors. Like I think, Nikki, they have red in the east in her culture. And so we have yellow in ours. And so it just depends. You have to pay attention to what group you're coming, what the orientation is. So we have our data collection and project identification here. And in the other cells there, I say discern methods and collect data, discern the issues and situations, and select the project. And then, of course, evaluation runs through all of those. In the south, the red direction down there, that's planning and development. We have our resources, activities, and expectations. And of course, evaluation runs through all of those. In the west, the black direction for us is Anishinaabe. We have implementation and coordination. And that's again, resources, activities, and outcomes. You'll see that resources and activities are same as planning and development because we're maintaining high fidelity to the plan, but we're also including the outcomes here and what actually is happening. And along with evaluation. In that northern direction, that white direction there, we have reflection and presentation. And we have our short, medium, and long-term goals. You know, how did those align with what actually happened? The recommendations along all of those lines and the evaluation processes.
Thank you.
Yeah, Lori.
Thanks. So in thinking, the idea of thinking 7 generations ahead, to what extent do you see that manifest when you're thinking about goals and outcomes? Does that show up when people are thinking about what do we want to achieve with this project? Are they, you know?
Yeah, you know, for people who are not used to that type of thinking, you know, it's really a challenge for them. It can feel overwhelming. Like, what do you mean? I got a plan for my great-grandchildren's great-grandchildren. How do you even start? So the other way I come at that is futurisms. You know, it seems a little more, I think, intriguing. You know, people are used to thinking about science fiction, right? And so they're used to thinking about like George Jetson and the flying cars, at least for my generation, right? So I think, you know, when we think about future studies or futurisms, that's another way to talk about thinking forward 7 generations. So I always like to think of it as a little baby, right? If you have this little baby that's born 7 generations into the future, what's that baby going to need? All right. What are we giving it right now that guarantees a bright future for that baby? Of course, then you multiply that by how many babies, right? And we really have to think about our responsibilities. So I always tell my students, there's a couple of ways we can do this. We can make predictions or we can design. Like we can guess. They're going to have flying cars. They're going to have artificial intelligence that just, it's everywhere, right? Those are predictions. And we all, you know, those are often shaped by science fiction or by what we read and imagine. But then there's the actually designing the future. And I think that's what we're really good at. You know, as researchers and evaluators, I think we can design stuff. Like we know, we've seen a lot, right? We kind of see if, you know, if someone tries to do this and then they do this, but it doesn't quite get that. We've actually seen how planning actually impacts the future. Evaluators are great at this stuff. You know, I can tell you something right now and you're going to be like, you know, in your mind, if you've done any evaluation, you're already calculating how is it going to come out. You already got to guess, right? Because you've seen people go through these processes and plan short term. So I think if we keep amplifying that and we get out toward those bigger things that are going to happen, like right now, you know, whoever, just shout out, what's like a 7th generation thought? You know, what are those big things that are, you would think is going to, you know, impact any 7 generation planning in our society?
Environment.
The environment,
Yeah, we'll be going to the moon.
space travel. How about online? You guys got any ideas about big stuff that's going to be impacting 7th generation from now? Shout it out, man. How about race relations? Boy, I sure hope that we're going to have good race relations in our society, in our world, right? So that's a big thing. How about gun control? How are we going to control how people are killing or not killing each other, including the more than human people? You know, those are big things, you know?
Don shared online, sustainability, development, climate justice, equitable education.
Yeah.
Lenore also said education, Crystal said military.
So yeah, let's focus on equity, you know? So, if we think about equity, I was just asked this the other day, do Native American people want equity in our world? That's an interesting question because, it's interesting because who determines what equitable means? Whose power, whose knowledge is that coming from? Because if you think about treaty relationships, Anishinaabe people, we're actually guaranteed a much better education than non-Native people in our society. So why would we want less education than we're guaranteed? Right? See, equitable doesn't necessarily mean a good education. If you want an equitable education in the United States, you might be getting a very poor level of education as compared to other ideas of education. So why would we want something less? So anyway, it isn't always, and I understand that some people think, okay, well, equitable doesn't mean equal, right? It means that these folks need this education, these folks might need these education for whatever purposes, whatever reasons. So I think that's one way to come at it. I think that's one way to think about that. And people they struggle to understand how are American Indian people in the United States living in a separate system than other people in the United States. It befuddles them sometimes. Because I think everyone has this idea that diversity and equality, diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging is like the big, DEIB now. And I think we get lost in that. Like on our campus at Northern Michigan University, our approach to diversity is 10 miles wide. And we forget that an Indigenous experience has very unique relationships. Colonization being the first one, right? And that all of these DEIB activities are taking place on our lands. So, I mean, if we really focus in on some of those ideas, I think those are what we have to consider moving forward. Like way out in there. So I've gone kind of a deep dive there, but I think it really does require us to think deep when we're thinking that far into the future.
Representation.
Representation.
Yeah, wasn't that the first, it's like recently, has in the past 6 months that they allowed the first, I don't know what tribe, but to come into US Congress, but they're not like to be representative of Native lands or Native nations, but they're not allowed to vote.
Yeah, so interesting, right? So, and this has been the case for a long time.
Yeah,
So tribes are the only level of government that's really not represented in the United States
Yeah.
structure.
Yeah.
How do tribes influence the United States decision-making? Well, administratively, we have to impress it on the administration, the relationships we have with the executive office through the Bureau of Indian Affairs, Department of Education, whoever, right? But not one of those Congress people represent a tribe.
right,
Even if they're Native themselves,
right,
they don't get elected to represent their tribe, they get elected to represent their state.
right. Right,
And so that is a big difference, right?
right.
Someone had a question online?
Well.
Oh, yeah,
Yes, please go ahead. Oh, wait, a second.
um,
Hold on, Ron. Is that Ron? Sorry, okay, sorry. I just wanted, Martel, if you wanted to come off mute to share your comment, otherwise I can.
Oh, yeah, sure, I can.
Okay.
Yeah, just the conversation and the points you were making made me think about how like when we use comparative statistics, right? And I come from like epidemiology, public health background, we're always comparing like our communities, Native people to non-Hispanic white people. But someone like my former boss would always say, like, but I don't want to be white. Like that's, it like inherently kind of positions it as a sort of goal.
Sure,
But
yeah.
it makes me think about how important it is that, Native communities are the ones defining what success, what wellness, like what all of that looks like for our own people.
That's exactly it. Right now, we're in an indigenous language crisis. We have endangered native languages all across the United States, some that are extinct and trying to be revitalized. So what standard should be used for each of these native languages? No, so if you ask some folks, to do standardize it, they're going to standardize it or try to anyway to English. What amount of words do kindergartners speak in English? Right? And if they're gonna say, well, then gee, maybe this indigenous group or that indigenous group should also have 5,000 words vocabulary for their kindergartners in the native language. Well, let's not forget that we have had disenfranchisement. We've had the carpet literally pulled out from under our tribes. And so for us, relearning our languages, revitalizing them is a lot different than the privileges and the access to language resources that English speakers have, where that's privileged in our society. So you really can't compare and contrast on that basis unless you take into consideration the history of colonization and the disenfranchisement of our tribes. So we should make our own standards. I've always told people in my tribe, let's create our own standards. That doesn't necessarily mean we don't want our students to also learn the scientific method or whatever, but maybe there's something that we want them to learn that is different and at a different level for our cultural communities. Let's go with Ron. I think he was like chomping at the bit there to say something.
No, I would appreciate it, but if we're not on Indian time, I'll just shut up.
No, please go ahead, Ron.
Okay, so we're not gonna cut off at 1. All right. Martin, this was a beautiful presentation, first of all.
Go ahead, thank you.
I love so many different things, but one thing was looking 7 generations out. I love how you put it in the context of my great grandkids. Anyways, and to think that far out with all the complexity going on and challenges of bringing together diversity through inclusion in an equitable way. Yeah, that's just an incredibly awesome challenge, and we need you and your ancient methods to be able to do that well. And so I thank you so much. And I'm first of all wanting to know if you're going to put this presentation online. If not, that's fine. Just so I could maybe use this beautiful medicine wheel form logic model for my students someday. I love doing service learning through in-class projects as well. And I think this is a nice way to help the students sum up what they're working on. So
yeah, let's talk further, Ron. Email me. I
will.
think you guys should know that Nikki, myself, and others, we are working on some publications right now. And of course, we have ongoing live presentations that we're doing based on the work that we've done. So, look for it, these kind of things. And, I have no problem when people use these things and reference them in a good way. But just make sure that you think about where they originate from and don't try to bastardize them to meet some nefarious purpose.
Thank you, Prof. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Yeah, please try to register for our next Eval Café. I will be joined by Dr. Elvis Fraser. He is the founder and managing director of Sankofa Consulting LLC. He will be speaking on what implication do growing discourses on equity, decolonization, development, and localization have on the practice of evaluation in international context next week. So thank you and have a nice evening, morning, and afternoon. Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody. Bye-bye.
So those of